And here we go. Now we there. Hey, sorry for the delay, everybody. We had everything you can imagine go wrong tonight. But we made it. Welcome to Statz Don't Lie, where we put facts over feelings on divisive debates. I am Statz, your host for tonight, and we have a guest here that I'm very excited about, Yogev Von Kundra. I met him through the Appalachian Peace Education Center, and I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about himself.
That's an honor to be here. I'm excited about this episode. My name is Yogev, which is modern Hebrew, and it means farmer, somebody who works with the land and cultivates the land. And that's what I do. And I do it in a way that honors the Jewish agricultural traditions of my ancestors and how I farm in 10 acres. I've got goats and cattle, and I do corn and herbs and vegetables. And in connection with the land is part of how I practice my Jewish faith and tradition.
All right. And since this is the first episode, I want to briefly tell y'all a little bit about me as well. If you're listening and you don't know much of my story, I am a native of Bristol, Virginia. I was pretty smart in high school and everything. Everybody thought I was just going to really be something in life. And then right after high school, I landed myself in prison for 9 years, 3 months, and 7 days for cocaine distribution. While I was inside, I educated myself, got involved in a lot of really positive things, and most of y'all that do know me since I've been home know that I hit the ground running and been out here just trying to make a difference ever since. I ran a nonprofit organization for a while, going into schools all over the region, doing seminars and stuff. I have worked with a lot of returning citizens, doing reentry programs and stuff, assisting with halfway housings, just all kinds of different things like that. And the topic that we're on tonight, we're going to be talking a lot about Israel-Palestine situation for the coming weeks. And the reason this is an important issue to me is because I am a Christian and I take my faith very seriously. When I say I'm a Christian, I want to specify, though, that I even use that term loosely now, just because of the connotations that often come along with it. I just consider myself a disciple of the Bible, man. I just try to learn as much about it as I can and try to, live a godly life. And after years of me really digging into scripture and studying, I started to have a lot of differences in things that I believe with the flavor of Christianity that I grew up around here in the middle of the Bible Belt. The American South, very fundamentalist type theologies here. And as I got older and started learning more and more about the situation in Israel, it made me start questioning a lot of things. And I found the answers to all those things in Scripture. And so, of course, when October 7th happened last year, like most other people, all eyes have been on that since, and it's been crazy to watch how we can get on social media or alternative news sites and stuff and see in real time everything that's been happening, right? But the narrative that we get on our news and that most of the people that we know and live around here is completely different in reality. Like, the narrative has been played so well in this situation, and it's crazy. So much so that even advocating for the rights of Palestinians is often equated today with being anti-Semitic or pro-terrorist or just all kinds of different things like that. So that's a little bit about myself and how we came to this situation. Now, Yogev, tell me a little bit about why this issue is important to you and how you came to it.
Yeah, similar to you, I feel practicing my Jewish faith is like how I live in relation to the land. Like, I want to dig deep into these issues and be true, to actually pay attention to what's actually happening as a result of what we're doing. And I think I appreciate what you're doing here, because I think a lot of people aren't willing to really look deep and look at the truth of these issues, because sometimes digging deep is dangerous, because sometimes what you find is ideas that make people uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. But it's sorting through that. And I think the scripture that you're talking about that helps guide you and how you live your life and where you find truth, we have that shared. As a Jew myself, Torah is the same as the Old Testament. And when I look at the teachings and the Jewish tradition, what I see is that of taking care of humanity, taking care of each other, healing the world. And that's not what I see from other Jews and Israelis, especially the Israeli government right now. And so how I got into this is because I have a rich family tradition, and how I live my life is a value of trying to reduce human suffering and to meet human need as much as possible. And that goes deep from stories I have about my great grandparents and what my great grandmother, how she led her life, and that's what carries me forward and how I operate in this world, and how I met you working with the Appalachian Peace Education Center. We're looking deep at these issues and finding a lot of common ground and doing advocacy to try to build that vision of what we see, and I think what Scripture is trying to teach us to do with our lives.
And so I think the first time I met you was probably, it's kind of crazy how I got connected with Appalachian Peace Education Center, because those of y'all that's been listening to me for a while, you know that I'm big on advocating the story, not of all Palestinians, of course, but especially Palestinian Christians, because I believe their story is like the missing link that a lot of Christian Zionists here in America that have never just really looked at the situation or thought it through. They just accept the narrative. It's like the piece that just throws a monkey wrench in the whole thing. You know what I'm saying? And so I've been really big on trying to connect with Palestinian Christians and amplify their voices. And long story short, I ran across a document that was put out in 2009 called Kairos Palestine. A lot of y'all have heard me talk about this already. And it's one of the most incredible things that I ever read. It is just very raw and honest about the reality of the situation, the reality of life under Israeli occupation. And they cover all sides of the conflict. Like they acknowledge the blame that lies also on certain Palestinian groups. They appeal to Jews, to their Muslim neighbors, to everyone. They talk about how Zionism, it not only distorts the image of God in the people who are oppressed by it, but it also distorts the image of God in the Jews who accept it as well. And I ran across somehow this link to join a webinar with Reverend Dr. Munther Isaac, who is the pastor of the Nativity Church in Bethlehem. And while I was on that seminar, there's like 200 people on it from all over the world. I hopped in the chat on a Zoom meeting and was like, listen, I'm from Virginia. I don't know anybody around here that's trying to advocate the way I'm trying to advocate, or that believes the way I believe. Could somebody please plug me in with somebody? And that's when I met Nancy from the Virginia Coalition of Human Rights. And she mentioned there's an organization down that way called Appalachian Peace Education Center. Well, I immediately got on Facebook and looked them up, and I see an advertisement for the following day, the next day, that they were having an event where a pastor that had just returned from the West Bank was going to be speaking. I'm like, oh, I got to go to this. And so the rest was history, man. I came and I met you guys that day. A week after that, I got to participate with you guys in having a meeting with Senator Tim Kaine to discuss him rolling back his support for arming Israel, given the circumstances. And it was beautiful because, everybody was present there too. You had Jewish people, Christians, Muslims, all together appealing to our elected official. Like, look, this is not okay. There's a whole lot of us there's just too much going on here. There's so much documented evidence of the war crimes that have taken place in the last year as Israel has assaulted Gaza. And it's just, some of it is just absolutely unreal. The death toll is staggering. There's over 15,000 confirmed child deaths. And this is just people they've identified. Like, that's not counting the thousands of people still under the rubble. Like, I think the death toll in this, once it's all said and done, is going to be so astronomical. Like, I think it's really far above and beyond what the official numbers are right now. But one thing that's really been an issue for me in advocating for Palestine, and I'm interested to get your experience from a Jewish perspective on the same thing, is how anytime I speak out in support or criticize Israel, it's inevitable somebody accuses me of being anti-Semitic for doing so. I do prison ministry too. I actually go back into a prison where I was housed at for 5 years of my incarceration. And the day after I came and did the event with you guys. No, it was the day of. I came and I filmed the event with Senator Tim Kaine that day, and that night I went back into the prison, and I was just really excited and was just briefly sharing a little bit with the guys there at the beginning of a church service. And I said something that ruffled some feathers. To me, just seemed like a reasonable thing to say. And all I said was, I know that all of you are praying for Israel right now. I know that you are. And I just want to ask you to also pray for the innocent Palestinians that are being crushed beneath this conflict. Because not everything you're seeing on the news is what it seems. It's not all cut and dry, black and white, right and wrong, the way that they're spinning it right now. And I'm telling you, the things that this extremist Israeli government, the administration that's running Israel right now, is full of a lot of extreme beliefs. And the things they're doing are absolutely atrocious. So I just kind of left it at that, right? Man, within 48 hours, I was getting calls from the other sponsors and stuff of the ministry talking about them guys. It was probably just 2 or 3 people, but they flew to the chaplain's office saying that I was making anti-Semitic statements and stuff. Like, I have run into this at every turn as I have tried to engage with people, whether it's other Christians or whatever. Like, people have it burned into their brains so much that criticizing Israel in any way is criticizing Jewish people as a whole and being racist. And it's kind of insane. And one thing that we were talking about, there's an issue that happened that's been on the news a lot last week that is a really great example of how things are twisted. And that is the situation with the Maccabi Tel Aviv football fans in Amsterdam. For those of you that haven't heard about this, basically, it's, in European football culture, man, you have each teams have followings that are just very, very diehard. You know what I'm saying? Back in the day, there's a whole lot of stories about how different cities playing each other, man. They called them hooligans. The fans would come together and brawl outside the stadiums and stuff, like, a lot of things like that. Well, what happened in Amsterdam, and there's ample video of everything I'm about to say. The Maccabi Tel Aviv football fans were running through Amsterdam, absolutely just doing some of the most blatantly racist, awful behavior. And after 2 days of it, they finally end up getting jumped in the streets. A big fight ensues. Some of them got beat up. And I don't advocate for violence in any situation. So, but no group of people in the world could go to any large city in the world and act the way these people was acting, and there not be some consequences. But the crazy thing about it is, after them running around singing songs that were talking about death to Arabs and why is there no school in Gaza, because there's no school kids left in Gaza, like saying some of the most just awful stuff. There's videos of them climbing apartment buildings and ripping Palestinian flags off of people's windows. There's pictures of them breaking up pallets on the sidewalk and passing out planks to each of them before they, continued on doing all the stuff they were doing. Like, they wreaked havoc in a city where they're not even from, got beat up, and the headlines all around the world, and especially here in America, even President Biden parroted it, is that a pogrom was taking place in Amsterdam. It got flipped immediately as being religious persecution. They got beat up because they're Jewish and they were in a place where a lot of Arabs were. That's what the narrative got spun to. Not they were all acting absolutely deplorable and got what they asked for. Which, if you see all the videos of everything that happened, is like clearly that's what happened. And so we see a whole lot of that. A whole lot of that. We even had another good example is early in the year, you had a situation in a city in California, and a Jewish citizen of that city went to city council because he had heard about a real estate event taking place at a synagogue. And at this synagogue, they were going to be selling homes in the West Bank, which, for those of you that don't know the ins and outs of the situation, all the settlements that keep being built in the West Bank are illegal under international law. Like, there's no way around it. And for them to be selling these homes here in an American synagogue, like, that was crazy. So this Jewish man came to city council, brought it to everybody's attention, like, this cannot happen. Like, this is unbelievable, right? Well, they didn't do nothing about it. So he organized a protest, and they came to the synagogue that day to protest while the real estate event was going on. And the headlines, and even President Biden and everybody the next day immediately were denouncing the blatant acts of anti-Semitism and how it's not okay to prevent Jewish people from going to their place of worship. No mention of the real estate event, no mention of why people were there. Just strictly, these are a bunch of pro-Hamas, pro-terrorist, anti-Semites, and we can't have this in our country. Meanwhile, we've had actual neo-Nazi rallies here in Tennessee. I say here in Tennessee, we both just said we was from Virginia, but you got to understand, I'm right on the border with Tennessee. I can look out my window and see Tennessee from my house right now. That's how close we are to the border. So I pay attention to politics in both states. And you had multiple rallies being held around the Nashville area and stuff a few months ago. Actual neo-Nazis out waving swastika flags, spewing all kinds of racist rhetoric. Not a peep of outrage about that anti-Semitism, the very real threat of anti-Semitism there. But Jewish students at a college can organize a protest demanding that their college divest from programs with Israeli companies that are helping to fund a genocide, and they get labeled as either self-hating Jews or anti-Semites, or they're not really Jews, or all kinds of, they're pro-terrorists, they're pro-Hamas. And it's just really insane, man. And so I want to I just want to know from your perspective. I lost your camera here. Hang on. We're going to have plenty of technical difficulties tonight. It's the first run, y'all. Bear with me. I promise it's going to get better.
I appreciate those examples because I think that speaks to where we're at as the world, where with fake news and certain narratives that people are holding on to that are fragile. They don't speak to the truth of what's really going on in the bigger picture. So I think part of why you're getting that resistance from the Christian community and all that is because I think this Zionist narrative is fragile. That this idea that Israel is just defending itself. You know, I think that example in Amsterdam shows that those Israelis were agitators. They were looking to pick a fight. Mm-hmm. You know, in California, where they're auctioning off land in the West Bank illegally, like, that's not in the news. I don't see that in the coverage in Amsterdam. I just hear Jews are under attack by racist, anti-Semitic. And I think part of that is how being Jewish has been equated to the Israeli identity. How if anybody critical of Zionism is being critical of the Jewish identity. And I can understand where we have a Jewish state with a current government who is Zionist, who is oppressive. That doesn't speak to my Jewish values and how I identify as Jewish. Part of what I appreciate about a Jewish culture is that we celebrate diversity, that we have a lot of different ideas that are all respected because truth isn't just singular. if all you hear is the same narrative over and over and over again, that's comfortable for people, because then it's easy to say, well, this is the way because this is all that I'm hearing. And then when you hear anything else, then you just reject it, you argue against it. But to be able to examine it as a faith that's tested in reality. So part of what that looks like for me is when I look at the Israeli state, there's certain narratives around how the Palestinian perspective can't exist with the lies, frankly, lies that of how, like, one thing that I heard a lot when I was in Israel is that Israel has always been attacked first. And if you look at the history, but it's not just the history, I think it's in Hebrew, the word, there's not really a word for history as much as it's memory, because the memory is something that lives within us. It's like that we carry this history through our blood and our flesh and our mind, and we share these ideas that continues to be alive. And when you look at the memory of the people, it's not as singular as just the perspective that we hear from the media. I think that when you dive in deeper, you see more.
And we had a conversation the other day, and we use the term over and over that I've thought about so much since, and I think I'm going to start using this in the way I talk about things, is we're really bad about this here in America too, is we put everybody in boxes, right? So you can have one trait that lines up with the label on this box, and we will put you in that box and completely disregard your individuality. You're part of this group now. You know what I'm saying? We do that with everybody, man. We split everybody up. We divide everything. We label everything. But when you zoom in on Israeli society, or when you zoom in on the citizens of Gaza, or when you zoom in on Christians in America, you start seeing a whole lot of different mindsets, beliefs, perspectives, all of these things. So how can you just say that all Jewish people are represented by this or by that, or any group of people to say that? And I want to know, though, I'm really curious about this. First of all, how did you come to advocate for the Palestinians' rights and standing against the things that the Israeli government has been doing? How did you come to that? Is that something that you've kind of always felt that way, or was there like some things you learned in recent years or something that kind of opened your eyes to it? And I also want to know, what are your own experiences with anti-Semitism, especially in the last year since this conflict has really blown up in the public view? And with all the talk of rising anti-Semitism, and you're somebody that I have seen rub shoulders with Christians, Muslims, atheists, and everything in between in the months that I've known you now, what is your experience as a Jewish man in those regards?
I first came to understand the Palestinian perspective when I was in college over 10 years ago. And what really hit home for me was hearing the story of Rachel Corrie. And I grew up from teachings like, so my dad, his grandmother, my great-grandmother Sarah, she was a Jew in Chicago. And she used to tell my father how important Israel was to our family. And I think many Jews have this experience too, that knowing as a displaced people, because growing up, one of the holidays that I remember the most was Passover, because Passover is kind of, it's the meaning of Passover is there's a prayer I really appreciate in Passover, that each and every generation has an obligation to experience liberation within our own blood, to remember what liberation is. So it's not just like the entire experience of Passover. We start around, most Jewish holidays start at sunset. And if we end by midnight, we've done well. So it's kind of a marathon. And throughout that whole holiday, we experience what it was like to go through dysphoria, to leaving Egypt, not having foods that would have been difficult for them to have, eating things like horseradish and bitter. And part of that is to experience what it's really like, and to tell the stories and hear the teachings of Moses and all that. And so it's really through that holiday that I really have like a deep appreciation, because it's also the story of my family and how my family has experienced liberation. And my great grandmother living in Chicago, she was an advocate for the Black community. So my dad remembers playing dice with the Black kids as she was meeting with Black leaders in the community to do advocacy and activism work. And my uncle was part of the civil rights movement, and he participated with the lunch counter sit-ins and used nonviolent action to address the injustices we have here in the United States against another oppressed people. And my great-grandmother also appreciated and respected Israel for what it meant as a displaced people that have been subjugated and experienced real pogroms, not like what happened in Amsterdam, but the genocide of a people that has, like, my family had fled Eastern Europe long before the Holocaust. And it was because of that violence that Jews experienced during that time that my great-grandmother taught my father that no matter what's going on in the world, that Israel will always be a safe place. And so my father really internalized that message. And so when I was in college, I learned the story of Rachel Corrie. And having conversations with my father about, because my father was much more pro-Palestine, but through me sharing my transformation, he was actually able to shift his perspective and understand and give more respect for the Palestinian perspective. And I think it's hard. It was hard for him when we just talk about what Palestinians were experiencing. But Rachel Corrie was around my age at the time that I was in college. She was 23 years old. She was in college, and she went to Gaza, to Rafah, was living with Gazans, and it was at another time of violence in the region. And she was protecting the home that she was staying in, the family that had been hosting her, and the Israeli government was in the process of destroying homes and families throughout Rafah, near the southern border with Egypt. And Rachel Corrie made the courageous decision to stand in front of a bulldozer and say, no, that this is wrong to destroy these homes. And tragically, the bulldozer, which was operated by an IDF soldier, ran her over and murdered her in front of a crowd of people.
While she was wearing a bright, safety vest. There's no way she wasn't visible. And I say that because investigations happened later on, because there was some international outrage about that situation. It caught a lot of attention. And of course, after the IDF investigated, they ruled it an accident. And that's it. We move on. And you see that happen all the time now. The World Central Kitchen Caravan. I don't know if you remember hearing about that.
Absolutely.
I think it was around probably April or so this year. But the World Central Kitchen has been instrumental in getting food in and feeding people in war zones all over. Like, that's what they do. They're well respected by everybody across the board. Like, Israel's thrown some digs at certain aid organizations here lately, like UNRWA and stuff like that. And that's a whole nother conversation. But World Central Kitchen, nobody questions them. Nobody questions their integrity, what their real goals are, none of that stuff. And a caravan of 3 of their vehicles, clearly marked with logos on the roof and on the doors, reported their position to the IDF before they started to travel, just like they're supposed to. And the front and back car in the caravan. They were spaced apart too. They weren't like driving bumper to bumper. They were both bombed at the same time. And then the third vehicle was bombed afterwards. And it was an accident. That's what they came with. It was a tragic mistake. How do you That's a crazy mistake, right? Like, they reported their position to you. They're clearly marked as being these aid vehicles. And you didn't just hit one. You didn't just hit two. You wiped them all three out. How do you make a mistake like that? And there's examples like that, man, over and over, not just through the current conflict that started on October 7th, but through many of the other conflicts, like Rachel Corrie. That was a whole different time and a whole nother. Gaza itself, just Gaza, has been bombed multiple times. There's been campaigns like every few years, basically. And a lot of people don't even realize, because a lot of Americans, just because of what they've been told, they simply look at Gazans as a bunch of terrorists, right? They held peaceful protests a few years ago. The Great March of Return is what they called it. And there's huge, detailed UN reports that go into deep detail about how Israel placed their best snipers up on hilltops near the gate as all the protesters came peacefully protesting. And day in and day out, they just sit there and snipe people, kids, old people, people in wheelchairs. There's testimonies of snipers bragging about how many kneecaps they shot, like just absolutely unhinged stuff. And I think most people don't understand all of that when looking even at October 7th. And yeah, I don't advocate for violence. What happened on October 7th was tragic. There was a whole lot of embellishments and lies told about what happened to get everybody riled up to justify what Israel came back and did. But regardless of any of that, whether they were terrorists or just resistance fighters, like all of that aside, it was a tragedy what happened that day, period. But it didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't just some unprovoked attack. It was the culmination of decades and decades and decades of absolute harsh treatment by the occupying power, which is Israel. And things finally exploded. And all of this stuff is so easily avoided. There has been many opportunities over the decades for some meaningful peace processes to take place. And I've heard multiple, Jimmy Carter was one of the first ones that was really vocal, the president. Like, you know, he got on interviews after he was president. He was like, man, they don't want peace. He said, they straight up don't want peace. They don't want a two-state solution. They don't want none of that. And most Americans don't know because they don't want to know. And most Israelis don't know because they don't want to know. That's the type of things he said. And even Donald Trump, when early in his presidency, the first term, there's video of him talking about, I always thought that the Palestinians just didn't want peace. But after going over there and negotiating some stuff, I realized that wasn't the case at all. I said, Netanyahu does not want a two-state solution. Like, right. They just don't want it. So, I mean, it's so well documented, man. That's the crazy thing. Like, everything that advocates for the Palestinians are saying, no matter how crazy as it sounds, there's receipts for all of it that are easily findable by anybody who just wants to look. But I think most people are so convinced that what they know is true, there's no reason to even look or to question Israel. I want to circle back, though. I want to know and hear a little bit about your experiences with anti-Semitism, if there are any, and what is your perspective on? I've heard a lot of Jewish American activists express that the only anti-Semitism they've experienced in the last year are from Zionists who absolutely rail against them for taking a stand against what Israel's doing. I've heard that so many times from so many Jewish activists. So I'm just interested to hear your take on all that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah. Participating with the Appalachian Peace Education Center, we've got Christians, we've got Muslims, and we've Jews beyond myself that have been doing this work together. And I think that us uniting, we bring all of our different perspectives to the table. And I haven't felt any kind of subjugation or disrespect or any kind of negativity toward me, myself, identifying as Jew and practicing Judaism. It's actually been the opposite. So I've actually made friends with some of the, we have a mosque in Johnson City where they've been at some of the events and speaking, like at the Senator Kane thing. There was a friend of mine now, Muhammad, who spoke, and he shared some really important information from the Palestinian perspective, where there's Palestinian Americans living here in our community who have lost dozens of members of their own families and so forth. And connecting to him on a personal level, it's him practicing his faith is sometimes hard in this community, and I actually want to support him and make sure that he's able to do that more. So one of the things that's come out of that is where I raise animals on my farm, it's hard for him to access meats that are processed in a way that's respectful to the animal, following his tradition of halal. And so he's able to come out to my farm, and I can sell him an animal and give him a space where he can honor his traditions. And I personally follow kosher. So the way that I've butchered my own animals for ones that we're going to eat, the practices that I follow share the same vision, where we're both halal and kosher, are both two different systems with the same goal of having healthy food for us with respect for the animal and creating a healthy environment for everyone, to where there's certain things that he's done that I now incorporate in how I do things. And so it's that sharing of culture that I think we don't lose value in our own identities and how we practice. It actually magnifies and enhances. And it's mostly from the Zionists that I've gotten attacked for identifying as Jewish and critiquing the Israeli government. And I think that for me, it's like what I'm advocating for is Jewish. Like if I look at the teachings, like Rabbi Hillel, I think put it well when he was questioned by a critic, like, what is Judaism really about? And he put it really succinctly and quickly that what is hateful to you, do not do to others. That is all of the Torah, and everything else is commentary. And following those teachings, how can you love your neighbor and through ethnic cleansing? How can you kill an entire people through genocide and say, this is the Jewish way? This is what the Jewish state does. So I think it's in your earlier point about what, with the violence and all that. I think that we're kind of at a point where I think Jews, we have a long history, and history is going to keep repeating itself until we learn our lessons. And the lesson is right there in Rabbi Hillel's message. And I've heard from like the Hilltop youth movement, the Zionist youth, that the settler culture and the violence that they're doing, they're calling this a third redemption.
Yeah.
That they're trying to create the state of Israel as promised in the Torah, but they're doing it the same way that has been causing the results that only is more violence against the Jewish people. Because what I believe my vision for a safe and thriving Israel is with a healthy relationship of respect, with having justice for the Palestinians. And the only way that we can break this cycle of violence is through love, is through healing, is through intergenerational trauma that we carry forward. And that's, I think, a lot of the actions, like with how anti-Semitism has been weaponized, it's because the Jewish people, we have a trauma. All that's happened to us with the pogroms, with the Holocaust, has been a justification for the violence. And I think that, like, we have a choice. There's an excellent book called The Choice, written by a Holocaust survivor. And I think that when, as a people, as a Holocaust survivor herself, she puts it this way: either you can fall into the hole of trauma and live in fear and operate from that place, or you can choose to rise above it and do better. And that's the vision that I have, is that through respect and Palestinian liberation, that without that justice first, there will never be peace in Israel. And it's a lie that that I hear in Israeli culture, that the only way towards peace is if there's not peace in Palestine, that we must continue this violence and this pain because that will keep them at bay. But that's a lie, and then the opposite is where I find my truth.
Okay. And I want to kind of circle back. We started off talking about the Maccabi Tel Aviv football fans, and just the hatred and bigotry and racism that was on display through the things they were chanting and saying and doing all through Amsterdam. And the thing is, when you look at the settler movement and its history, and especially you mentioned the Hilltop Youth and stuff, for those of you who don't know who they are, I mean, everything that you imagine when you think about Islamic jihadist extremists, these are like Jewish versions of that. They have been terrorizing the West Bank for decades, since the Six-Day War in 1967. And I'm sure there's somebody out there that's going to hear me say that, and they might know a Jewish friend or something that lived in a settlement or something, and they're a good person, and they're like, oh, I can't believe you would say something like that. Here's the thing. Once again, when you zoom in on a group of people, you're going to find individuality. But when you zoom out on the settler movement, the people that are really making things happen, that are really influencing the direction that things are going right now, are this extremely radical faction. A lot of people refer to them as Kahanas because most of them follow the Rabbi Kahan. They were very messianic. They are, they look at everything they're doing as their religious God-given duty. They're redeeming the land by cleansing it of these evil Arabs. Like, that is the whole narrative and mindset. And the scary thing is that many of these people of that mindset now hold powerful positions in Israeli government. Netanyahu is absolutely always been influenced by these factions. Now you got like Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Minister of Defense. This dude has literally been convicted of terrorism by Israeli court. He is a Hebron settler. And if you know anything about the situation over there, the settlements of Hebron have always been some of the most brutal. They're right dead in the middle of the most populated city in the West Bank. And for those that say that there's no apartheid in Israel, I'm sorry, you cannot look at Hebron and look at me with a straight face and say that, like, without just being a bold-faced liar. They literally call some of the streets sterile streets, and Palestinians are not allowed to walk on those streets. And if the front door of their house happens to be on that street, it's welded shut. They got to climb out the back of their house into the alley and over other buildings just to go anywhere to leave their home and come back. That's insane. Like, I don't care who you are, what you believe. That is insane. And it's these elements that are in these key positions of power in the Israeli government now. And so the way that the whole weaponizing anti-Semitism thing is happening with over here, it's like I can't criticize an actual terrorist for slaughtering thousands and thousands of people live streamed on television every day. I can't criticize that without criticizing all Jews. Like, what sense does that make? Like, it's just insane. There's a bill that almost got passed, or I thought that it had actually, but I just saw some stuff in the news the other day that they're trying to slide it in again into a defense bill. But it's this anti-Semitism act where they're trying to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism. And it's worded very vaguely. And I even saw a comment given by someone who was part of that organization that said that the definition they came up with there was not like meant to be made law anywhere or something. It was just kind of like a generalization. And it is kind of vague, but it can be interpreted in a way that criticizing Zionism or Israel is the same as hating Jews. So that's a very dangerous precedent here in America, because what that means is with a bill like that, these student protests and stuff that they've already been demonizing and trying to make out to be these pro-terrorist, pro-Hamas, you know what I'm saying, just den of vipers, like the way they paint it is just so crazy. But that can be a hate crime with this type of bill. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's a scary thing. Us having this conversation right now, with that bill in place, the government could come after us for having the thoughts, no matter how reasonable they are, no matter how loving they are, and still extending grace to people who don't understand completely. Because that's one of the things that's hardest for me, is like, especially a lot of my fellow Christians. And this is going to sound arrogant at first, but bear with me. Here's how I know that I know more than they know about this situation. Because I know them. And I know the kind of people they are. I know the kind of heart they have. And I know if they knew what I know and what I've learned, they would be absolutely heartbroken that they had ever supported what's happening.
Mm-hmm. What would Jesus do? I don't think he would be bombing Palestinian children.
Well, that's another thing too, and that's maybe we'll do a part 2 and dive into this.
Yeah.
But the close links, when you examine it, between Christian Zionism and Christian nationalism, and they're both so dangerous. But it all like springs from we've got like these American myths that we've adopted. The patriot myths, you know what I'm saying? Like, our founding fathers were these just upstanding people that were just fighting for our freedoms. And when you zoom in on the situation and those people and all the circumstances, it's not quite that clean cut. There's like a war going on, especially since 2020, against educating people about our actual real history in this country, the history of racism, the history of genocide. But there's a war against even being able to teach those very real things that's happened. And like in the documentary Israelism, which you was able to recently watch, the same types of things are going on in Israeli society. It's an attempt to rewrite history, basically, to the same way Americans, we always paint ourselves as the good guys in every situation. The same types of things that happen in Israeli society with the way Israeli history is being taught. One thing that you hear becoming more and more popular, and we got some politicians coming into power in place that are saying these very things. It's stuff like, there's no such thing as a Palestinian. There was never really a Palestine. All of these concepts are extremely popular. And it's like, if you take a look at history, like that's not accurate to say at all. Like that's kind of crazy. But that's where we are, man. We I think have been programmed so much to look at things certain ways. And like I say that I used to be in the same boat. And I didn't get out of it because like I'm smarter than other people or I'm better or anything like that. I just had time to sit down when I was in prison and start trying to figure out, all right, why do I believe what I believe? And I read an insane amount of books in there. I educated myself. I was able to meet people of all walks of life and learn about them. And it changed and molded my perspectives. You know what I'm saying? And when you just take an honest look at the history of America, it's just like, man, we just want to completely ignore it all. All the bad things. We just want to completely ignore them. And we don't look at the bad things to make ourselves feel bad. We look at the bad things to learn from them. You know, how do we not do this again? And I also think a lot about this situation now, how the official narrative as a whole, most of this country is either indifferent or many of them kind of support Israel because they think they're the bastion of democracy in the evil Middle East. You know what I'm saying? They're our one ally, which I always ask people, like, who was our enemy in the Middle East before Israel? But we're so used to this narrative, though, that most people don't even take the time to dig in and figure out why they believe what they believe. I just had the opportunity to do that. And once you see these things, though, it's like you can't unsee it. And I often wonder, and people often ask, like, when you learn about, like, the Holocaust, I remember, you know, learning about the Holocaust and stuff in high school and everything. And we just kind of have this perception of Germans as being just like these evil people that just hated Jews and went and did all this stuff. And it wasn't until I ran across a biography, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was a German. He was the son of one of the most prominent psychologists in Berlin. And his mother's side of the family was from a long line of Lutheran priests. And anybody that knows about German culture and Lutheranism, the Reformation happened in the area that is now Germany. Martin Luther was from that area. And so the German identity, especially at that time, was very closely linked to their pride in the Lutheran church. You know what I'm saying? And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was just an extremely intelligent young Christian. And in his biography, I started to look at the German people on a more personal level, zooming in a bit. Because he talks about in there how Hitler, when he first started to come to power, weaponized the Lutheran church. And he did it by finding some obscure letter that Martin Luther wrote, like, late in his life. Some Jewish person had done him wrong, and he wrote this scathing letter about him, right? Hitler published this letter and, like, circulated it everywhere and used it to help fuel the fire of anti-Semitism within the church first. Nobody thought he was going to go try to exterminate them all at that point. You know what I mean? But that's how you slowly garner support. It starts turning everybody to do and eventually carry out the things that they did. And we often wonder, like, how could you be alive at that time and not take a stand for that, not be okay with it? And it's like, if you're supporting what's happening in Gaza right now, you're doing that. Like, we're in that type of moment right now where the history books is going to look back and people are going to wonder, how was Americans supporting and okay with their tax dollars funding these atrocities? And I believe with all my heart that that's where we're at right now. So
that's well put. I like how you weaved across a lot of different, like, how our country here was founded on the genocide of Native American people. I think about how Israel was founded. It's like it wasn't just a blank slate when settlers came from Europe to North America. And I see that in Israel. I think that there's so many, like, those parallels, like all those examples you gave. And history is important for us to look at. And how is this story going to end? I feel like the whole world is watching the Middle East. And a lot of people don't want to make that connection of like, we are a part of this story too, that we are the ones that are the actors contributing to how this story ends, that we get to decide. And I think that depending on what your prophecy is, what your vision for what the world looks like, people are building different and focusing on different perspectives and only given a narrow lens to try to justify, what's going to happen. And I think that for some Christian nationalists, it's the end times.
Yeah.
They're seeing like, okay, they can see, all right, let's Iran and Israel exchange some nuclear bombs, and maybe then Jesus will come back.
Yeah.
So I think that there's certain stories that people are okay with because it fits into the prophecy. And I think that when I look at scripture and I say, how is this story going to end? I look to my great grandmother. She composed this song called Israeli Lullaby, and it was written a long time ago. And I think that this, her prayer, her vision for peace in Israel, she wrote this at a time when there was also a lot of violence. In this song, she speaks about when blood is mixing with the sand and where Palestinian and Israeli children cannot sleep well. And she has a vision, it ends that, but there will come another day when peace will rule this land, and there will be another boy to play upon that sand. So go to sleep and have no fear, for you are safe tonight. And that, when I look at scripture, I see that we as a people, as a Jewish people, as Christians, that we have a responsibility to create heaven here on earth. That we were given a moral code of how to live in peace, and we've got a choice to make. We can create heaven here on earth. We can stop sending bombs that our government, here as United States citizens, we are allowing our government to continue to send these bombs that is literally creating hell on earth. When I look at the realities and I hear the story of what it's truly like to be a Gazan today, to live in the West Bank. And also, I have sympathy for the Israelis who have experienced violence as well. And I have a vision that when we act in justice, when we act as our faith or our tradition or whatever our moral code or wherever that comes from, and we do good and we follow that tradition, then we can have peace for all of humanity. So I think that we're kind of at the crux we're at the middle of that story, and we can go either way. I think Christian nationalists want to create peace here in this country by getting rid of closing the borders, not allowing more people to come in, saying we want a country that's predominantly white. And what about our white nationalism? Just as I hear that story in Israel of we want a Jewish state where we're going to ethnically cleanse anybody else for any other perspective. But what if we can have a Palestinian state and an Israeli state? One of the things when I was in Israel, I see the diversity of there's Christians, Muslims, Arabs, and Jews all living together. So what would that look like? How can we live in cooperation? How can we live in a global society where we respect one another and live in peace because we have that same shared value when you really dive in deep enough, and we all are made of the same stuff and need the same thing. And getting back to what you're saying with anti-Semitism and Zionism, it's like the way that anti-Semitism has been weaponized is in defense of Zionism. And what is Zionism to me? Zionism is this vision for Israel to continue to conquer as a colony, as Israel has the systemic power in the equation, how they have created this apartheid system where Palestinians do not have the same rights and so forth. And it's not about fault. It's not about, okay, well, Hitler did this to the Jews, and then now they're, it's their right or whatever to defend themselves. Like, to me, it's like, I think that when Israelis get attacked and they point the finger at Hamas and say Hamas is the problem, we must kill all of them. And then what's actually happening is they're killing civilians instead. They're killing the people that aren't actually responsible. To me, it's not about fault, it's about responsibility. And when my vision for living in a world that is just and peaceful, if people's needs are taken care of, then everybody can rise to that vision.
Mm-hmm.
But if you are living in fear and you subject a person and you put him in a cage and you treat him like an animal, then I'm not surprised that they're going to want to retaliate and they're going to want to fight for their liberation, because that's in all of our blood, and anybody would do that. So I put the responsibility in the Israeli government to do better, and I put the responsibility in our U.S. government that for the sake of the world, we need to do better.
There's certainly a lot of differences between Jewish and Christian beliefs on some things, but there's one thing that is consistent through the Old and New Testaments, and that is that God continually tells his people to take care of the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant. And that's always my response to people who talk about America being a Christian nation. If you judge us by those four things, how we treat those four groups of people here in America, how Christian do we look? If you look at how Israel is and following those four things, how Jewish do they really look? And it's easy for Christians to get caught up, though, here in America in this whole rapture theology stuff that teaches them that, well, this is all about to come to an end anyways. The whole goal is to just get as many people saved as possible before God just rains hell down and destroys everybody else and takes us away first. And all of that is just extremely bad theology. None of those beliefs even existed before the 1800s. And I ain't gonna dive into that much because I'll take off in a whole different direction. But the way that people believe the Bible, whether Jewish or Christian, has a lot to do with how they look at this situation. The extremist factions of Jewish society, the settlers, the hilltop youth, all of that group, they believe that it is their duty to tear down Al-Aqsa Mosque and build the third temple so that the Messiah can finally come. Christian Zionists believe that, and there's 10 Christian Zionists for every Jewish Zionist in America. Christian Zionists have made all of this possible in ways that most people do not realize. And most of them follow a train of theology that says that we're living in the end times, that the creation of Israel was a fulfillment of prophecy. There's some variation on this next part, but basically, once the third temple is built, Jesus will come back. So they share that same element between the Kahanists in Israel and Christian Zionists here. It's all about that third temple. Mm-hmm. And once that's built, we're going to zip up out of here and God's going to just destroy everybody else. And it's crazy, man. Like, we are one thing that is shared among all the Abrahamic religions is the goodness of God's creation and our role in bringing redemption to the earth, redeeming the time, redeeming the land. And redeeming the land doesn't mean clearing it of everybody that isn't like you. It is being a good steward of the land. It is taking care of this world and the people living in it. That is the heart of all three of these religions. It is the heart of everybody. It should be the heart of everybody who says that they believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But what we're seeing today being perpetrated is not that. And I've used this language very much in the last year, that I believe that the Jewish and Christian faiths have been hijacked by the Zionist ideology. And even the concept that it's a Jewish and Muslim conflict, that's so far removed from reality when you look at history. You can find certain instances, but for the most part, Jews were experiencing anti-Semitism from white European Christians, and were living in relative peace throughout the Muslim world at that same time.
Absolutely.
Everybody that I've met, and I've met a lot more people in the last year, and a lot of them through the Appalachian Peace Education Center. Everybody I know that's been to Gaza or that's been to the West Bank. I've met a couple Jewish people that have done humanitarian work in Gaza, actually gone there and lived for a time. Everybody tells me the same story, that the people there are gracious and loving and hospitable. They don't care if you are of a different religion. Everybody respects each other for the most part. I mean, sure, you're gonna have some fringe elements here and there, but like, that's the way it could be and ought to be. But we all have these extreme, crazy views of each other that were born from pure propaganda. And you know, when you talked about meeting Muhammad earlier and getting to know him and all the similarities y'all have and stuff, I think that's what a lot of people are lacking. Is it wasn't until I went to prison and started meeting Muslims and having serious conversation, I became good friends with the guy who was the imam over the Sunni community at one of the prisons I was at for like 5 years. We used to have some really deep theological conversations with each other, knowing that you believe differently and I believe differently, but we was able to talk about those things and connect in a beautiful way on the similarities, but still respect each other's differences. I learned a lot about my own faith from having those conversations with him. And I think that's something that most people in America are lacking. That's why, you know, everybody talk about anti-Semitism being on a rise. We need to be talking about Islamophobia being on the rise. The way that Muslims are portrayed and always have been portrayed since especially like 9/11. I was a freshman in high school when 9/11 happened. That shaped my worldview in a big way. I grew up in a church that, you know, taught that Islam was a cult and they hated Christians and they hated infidels. They just wanted to murder everybody and blow themselves up so they can get their 40 virgins, like all of them tropes, right? That's all I knew of Islam. That's all I knew of Muslims. But when you zoom in and you meet a person and you connect, all of that starts to crumble. All of the propaganda, all the preconceived notions, they start crumbling. And it's no different than, like, my grandmother, when she was alive, all my life I looked at her as one of the most godly women I knew, right? Now, she grew up in an area called Hickory Tree. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's in Tennessee. It's not too far from here, really. But she grew up in that area. She was born like in the, 20s, 30s, something like, you know what I'm saying? And my aunt started dating a black guy when I was in high school. And it upset my grandmother so bad. And it shocked me. And I remember asking her, like, why are you mad about that? Like, what's wrong with her being with dude? Like, dude's super cool. He's a good dude. You know what I'm saying? It's just not right. It's just not right. You're just not supposed to mix races. I'm like, who says? Like, where does that come from? She thought that the Bible taught that. She'd always lived in an echo chamber, though. All of her theological knowledge was given to her in an echo chamber where everybody believed the same things and said the same things. And it wasn't until she was confronted with reality that it made her question it. She'd never even questioned that before. But then she got to know this dude, and you could just see the scales fall off her eyes. You know what I'm saying? It changed her life to just meet and get to know a black person and realize, man, they really not so much different than us.
Right.
And I think that's a big part. That's part of the reason why I want to bring different people with different backgrounds on this show too. I want to have a Muslim sitting in that chair soon. I want to have a Palestinian. I want to have a Palestinian Christian. I want to, you know what I'm saying? I want all these different perspectives because I feel like people need to just be exposed to each other.
Are you familiar with the Shema?
No.
There's a Jewish prayer, probably the most recited Jewish prayer recited twice a day, and it's really simple. It's Shema, Ya Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Ahad. And to me, it literally translates Shema as listen. Ya Israel is listen, Israel. Adonai, our God, our Lord, our God is one. So the word ahad, meaning one, I think that's central to we are all related. Like there's not only one true God, but we are one true people. We are brothers and sisters, like all within humanity. We're all descendants of the same humans from the same Holy Land. And I think that one of the things that I appreciate, because I think that we might have different perspectives and all that, but I appreciate, like I've learned things from Muhammad's perspective about Muslim culture that is valuable to me. One of the things that I really get out of Christianity that I think took Judaism in a new direction is Jesus' teachings of forgiveness. So I want to speak to anybody out there that's listening who maybe this is the first time that they've heard some of these ideas. Maybe you've come to this conversation through your Christian faith and say to anybody that we all have a responsibility in the story that's being told. And depending on, our lives or whatever, maybe we take that responsibility different, but we can all find forgiveness in this moment right now and show up for this vision that we can all share of a world of peace and justice. And I think what that looks like is something that you as a Christian, me as a Jew, and Muhammad are all uniting around, is that the United States needs to stop sending these weapons to Israel. And there's a Jew in Congress right now who has introduced and sponsored the joint resolution of disapproval, saying that we, as the United States, have already allocated funds, $2 billion that will be spent on weapons, but doesn't need to be, that we can actually stop that from happening right now. So I encourage anybody out there who wants to find forgiveness in their heart for the responsibility that our country has taken and each of us perhaps have for what's happening in the Middle East, and say, I want to contribute to a narrative that fulfills that prophecy of peace and justice in the world, and that can start right there in the Middle East, because I see it as a mirror. No. Everybody's looking at the Holy Land because we see something there that speaks deeply to who we are. And right now, we can contact our congressmen. If you're here in Virginia, Senator Kaine and Senator Warner, there's a vote coming up in the Senate. Contact your senators wherever you are. Contact your House of Representatives. They're looking for co-sponsors in the House, because this joint resolution, if passing the House and the Senate, can end this pipeline of weapons to Israel.
So go ahead and plug real fast the Appalachian Peace Education Center. Let everybody know how they could get involved if they wanted to. And I think that's a good note to end on here tonight. We'll have a part 2 to this before too long. But go ahead and tell us a little bit about that. People that want to get involved. If
you go to appalachianpeace.weebly.com, or you can just Google Appalachian Peace Education Center. You can find our website there. We've got a tab there you can become a member, you can contact us, you can get involved. If you're financially blessed, you can make a donation. We need volunteers. We need people that can give their time, and like what I mentioned, contacting Congress, that like can take you as little as 1 minute to do, and join this movement, join this coalition of not just Jews, Christians, and Muslims, but we also welcome Buddhists and atheists and whoever. Everybody is welcomed in our diverse community, because we all unite around humanity living in peace and justice.
And you know, that ought to be the American dream, right? To be a land of diversity and everybody living in peace with each other and having prosperity together and all of those things. Instead, we have this just incredibly selfish version of an American dream. But I have felt blessed to get connected with the Appalachian Peace Education Center, though. Being able to meet all these different types of people, how refreshing it has been to just be around like-minded people on this issue, because I usually feel like the odd man out in every situation when it comes to talking about this, whether it's with family, friends, my spiritual family, with my church folks and stuff. Like, man, people just think I've gone off the rails because I'm tired of my tax dollars slaughtering children. So yeah, I really appreciate getting to know you guys, man, and being a part of everything going on. I appreciate that you guys are actually about doing stuff. I mean, I've got the opportunity to meet with Virginia Senator twice in the few months that I've been coming around y'all. And that's because y'all are really about doing things, not just talking about stuff, not just fussing about it and protesting, but actually doing things. Let's get out here together, figure out a way to make a difference. That is super refreshing in today's world, man, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate you coming on here tonight, man. I appreciate all the things you shared, your personal experiences and everything, man. Thank you so much for coming. We'll be back next Sunday night. I will have Langley Casual Words Shazor on. He's an old friend of mine who lives in the Virgin Islands now. We're going to have a really nice show for y'all then. Thank you for everybody that tuned in. Apologize for all the technical difficulties. This is the first show, though. I knew something was going to end up going wrong. I just didn't know every single thing that could have gone wrong was going to go wrong. But hey, we made it through it. But yeah.